Dream Tower Media presents the Literary Wonder and Adventure Podcast. This episode, Edgar Rice Burroughs, Master of Adventure, a conversation with author Ryan Harvey. Welcome to the Dream Tower. I'm your host, Robert Zoltan. I'm here with Edgar the Raven, my untrustworthy sidekick.
Slander!
Edgar, our special guest today will be arriving at any minute, so I want you to be on your best behavior, okay?
Who's the fool?
Stop it, or you'll be spending the night outside with the other crows.
Slander! I'm a raven.
Whatever. Our honored guest today is author Ryan Harvey.
Never heard of him.
Silence!
Never heard of him.
What does that prove?
Rah!
Okay, Edgar, give the audience a list of your favorite authors.
Edgar Allan Poe.
Right, okay, a few more.
Edgar Allan Poe.
Uh-huh, and?
Edgar Allan Poe.
Okay, enough. I think everyone gets the point. You need to expand your list of authors, and you could start with Ryan Harvey. For your information, Ryan Harvey is an author of science fiction and fantasy, and the recipient of the famous Writers of the Future Award in 2011. His winning story, An Acolyte of Black Spires, from his Antarctica series, appears in Writers of the Future Volume 28. He's a regular columnist for Blackgate magazine, and his fiction has also appeared in Everyday Fiction and the anthology Candle in the Attic Window. His ongoing series in the continent of Antarctica explores the many different nooks of science fantasy in a literary gumbo of dinosaurs, bizarre tech, and fantastic adventure. Oh, that must be him now. Edgar, on your best behavior, or else. Now, up. Up to your perch. Up. Hey, Ryan. Welcome to the Dream Tower.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Whoa, was that a Pteranodon?
Yeah, I actually saw quite a few on the way here.
Oh, geez, I've got to spray again. Come on in, have a seat.
Wow, you've got a raven.
Howdy do.
Yeah, well, he was on sale.
Murder!
So, Ryan, you've been busy for a few years now writing a series of articles on Edgar Rice Burroughs for Blackgate magazine. Now, for those few people who are unfamiliar with the name, would you mind giving us a brief bio of Edgar Rice Burroughs?
Edgar Rice Burroughs was born in 1875 in Chicago and died in 1950, a few months short of his 75th birthday, in Tarzan, California, or technically Encino. And the Tarzan name is not a coincidence. That part of the San Fernando Valley is named after his most famous creation, Tarzan. So Burroughs, after a very undistinguished first part of his life with brief stint in the military for 10 months with the 7th Cavalry, he went into business for himself a couple times and failed at each one. He worked for a railroad company as a police officer. He started a general store in Idaho, and then he went into sales and advertising. He worked for a while as a head of a stenography department at Sears and Roebuck, And by 1911, he had a wife, 3 children, and was working for a pencil sharpener company, putting out sales agents to sell pencil sharpeners, and it was so far had been a pretty uneventful life so far, and he was barely scraping by. And while working for the pencil sharpener company, he used to look through the pulp magazines that he sometimes placed ads in. He would read the stories during the long, dull stretches when nothing was happening, and he thought, I should try my hand at writing these stories. I can't write anything worse than the stories I'm currently reading. And wrote a book called Under the Moons of Mars, which today is known as A Princess of Mars, sent it into the top pulp company at the time, Munsey's Magazines, and they bought it.
So that was his first book that he wrote?
That was his first book. He had written a short little children's book about 10 years before, and he illustrated it himself. He was an actual adequate illustrator. He used to do illustrations when he was in the military for some military newspapers.
Okay.
So he did some early illustrations. But he had never tried to write a novel of any kind. There was no association with science fiction whatsoever in his background. And he managed to sell it. And the amount he got for it was a shock to him. And he then started to write further Mars adventures. And because his third book, something called Tarzan of the Apes, became a smash sensation, he suddenly dropped all other work he was working on and went into writing fiction full time, and certainly during the teens was turning out just a remarkable amount of work. He became the first writer to incorporate himself. Edgar Rice Burroughs Incorporated, started his own company. He moved to the San Fernando Valley, bought a large ranch there, started his own office in 1927. He began to make a lot of money off sales to Hollywood studios for the Tarzan movies. He made a lot of money off of comic strips, but kept writing throughout the rest of his career until pretty much was active right up until his death in 1950. And there were some ups and downs in his writing career, certainly. But the money kept coming in pretty steadily, although he liked to live pretty lavishly. He spent a large part of the 30s living in Honolulu.
So the first 2 books were the Mars books?
No, the first 2 books was A Princess of Mars and then a book called The Outlaw of Torn, which is a medieval-style romance that was one of Edgar Rice Burroughs' crucial early lessons in what it is to be a professional writer, because he wrote Outlaw of Torn at the request of the editor of Munsey's Magazines, Thomas Newell Metcalf. Once he got this unclassifiable scientific romance on Mars, Metcalf's mind immediately went to what was popular, which was sort of standard medieval romances, usually an imitation of Sir Walter Scott. He told Burroughs, wrote to him and said, why don't you write something in terms of a standard romance? I think you'd be really good at it.
So he could see that he had talent, but he kind of wanted to reel him in and make sure that he was going to go in a direction that was going to make money for the publisher.
Yeah, Metcalf, and this is a key thing about Burroughs, which is he was a huge innovator. When someone like Metcalf saw a work like A Princess of Mars, of which there really was almost no precedent for what Burroughs had written, it was almost his lack of experience that caused that book to be written. He didn't know what it was people were writing, except he didn't like the current things in the pulp. So
he didn't know that he wasn't supposed to do that. Right?
Which is what Tolkien, it was the same kind of thing. He didn't know he wasn't supposed to be writing this kind of
Ignorance
material.
is bliss.
Burroughs really thought Outlaw of Torn was a successful work, and Metcalf said, I don't like this. Burroughs said, okay, I'll re-edit it. And he spent a whole long period trying to please Metcalf with this book, and Metcalf ultimately didn't want it. And that was the last time that Burroughs ever attempted to go into a round of revisions to please an editor. From that point on, if someone didn't want to buy it, he would sell it someplace else. And he taught Metcalf that lesson in a pretty harsh way when he sent Metcalf the second Tarzan novel after Tarzan of the Apes was a smash hit for the magazine. He wrote the next one, sent it to Metcalf, who then said, yeah, I don't like this, and I'm not going to buy it.
Who's the fool?
So he sent it someplace else.
He turned it right around and sent it to a news story magazine that bought it for even more money. Metcalf, in a really bizarre bizarre attitude for an editor, wrote to Burroughs angry at him that he had sold it to another magazine, as if Metcalf felt that it was his obligation. Yeah, I passed on it, but we're buddies. Why'd you sell it to somebody else? And Burroughs wrote back saying, and I think this is probably an exact quote, he said, "I'm not writing these stories out of friendship. I'm writing them because I have a wife and 3 children." And it was from that point on, at least for the teens and the 20s, Burroughs was a guy who put his stories basically on the auction block and could usually pick up the best rate for them. Because he was really the first superstar in the pulps, a man whose name on the cover sold the magazine.
Let's go back to, talking about Under the Moons of Mars, which was then changed to a print. When was that changed to a Princess of Mars?
For the book printing.
Okay.
It was for the serial version was Under the Moons of Mars.
And was that Burroughs' title, the new one?
Yeah, he picked the title of Princess of Mars.
A Raven of Mars.
So that book was fairly successful, but you're saying it wasn't until Tarzan that he really took off. How successful was A Princess of Mars?
Princess of Mars was, based on reader reaction, was the best thing people had felt they'd ever read in All Story, which is the name of the magazine. And it was one of the big pulps. There were not as many pulps in the teens as there would be in the 20s. It was still mostly general interest pulps. There was no science fiction pulp yet. There were no specific horror-based pulps. They were usually general interest adventure pulps. Under the Moons of Mars was so beyond what anybody had ever seen that it caused a big reaction, but it wasn't until Tarzan that the audience just went completely wild, although Burroughs had trouble selling it to a publisher at first. He couldn't get it to a book publisher. They kept turning him down.
Interesting.
It wasn't until about 3 years later that he actually got a company called A.C. McClurg, a publisher that for the next pretty much 15 years published all of Burroughs' hardcovers. And they picked it up, and when that book just started selling out is when Burroughs was aware that Tarzan was a huge deal, and he could start trying making movie deals off of it.
Tarzan came out in book form.
First publication was 1913. Was the serial publication. That's when the magazine was published. It was 1913.
But the book, when did the book come out?
The book came out in 1915, I believe. I'm not 100% sure on the exact date of when the A.C. McClurg volume was.
It's just amazing how long ago those were written. When I reread A Princess of Mars, actually when I read it the first time, I forget when, I was just struck by, of course in ways it sounds dated, as almost everything does, and I don't know if dated is the proper term, but you have references that maybe don't hold up and certain specific styles of writing, but I was just astounded by that he wrote that in like 1910.
No, first draft was 1911, and it was published in All Story in 1912.
Yeah, and so many references I saw that pointed straight to Star Wars. That just kind of blew my mind.
A Princess of Mars is an intriguing book in Burroughs' history because, one, it's his first, but it also shows him still trying to work in the literature of the past, the Victorian-style adventure story, while also moving into his own style. The early parts of A Princess of Mars are very much what I would call walkthrough fiction.
Yeah, the first quarter of the book, third of the book, has almost more of like an H.G. Wells feel to it. The character kind of narrating his experience, what the planet was like and what he sees, and then the action picks up.
Yeah, that was typical of Victorian fantasy literature. For instance, H. Rider Haggard, his novel She, which influenced just about every adventure writer. A lot of that is the main character being toured around the kingdom of she who is not to be named. Right. I'm sorry, she who is to be obeyed. Mm-hmm. And at first, Princess of Mars is a lot of here's the Thark civilization. Here's how Thark culture works. And then it starts becoming a swashbuckler. And that's where Burroughs was the real innovator. Yeah. He dropped most of that description stuff and made the description part of the action. And when you get to the next Mars book, The Gods of Mars, which is one of Burroughs' best works, there's almost no trace left of the Victorian trappings. Yeah. It is just, it hits the ground running, and it's insane from start to finish.
Yeah, it was it just incredible. Would make an incredible serial. They always want to make movies out of these things, but I see like The Gods of Mars could make a good 8-part miniseries or something.
Yeah.
It's a constant cliffhanger happening
Yeah,
from one chapter to the next almost.
That's one of Burroughs' best examples of his ability to constantly elevate the story right when you think it's going to drag. There's some of his books in his later period you can feel where he's going to start losing the momentum. With Gods of Mars, he's at the top of his game. Right when you think it's going to lag, he throws in something completely crazy, some new civilization, and the book just keeps plowing ahead until he hits the book on a cliffhanger, and he ends you on a cliffhanger.
Yeah, that's true. That's the one thing about the book, yeah.
It's a cruel cliffhanger.
It is. It's a huge cliffhanger that makes it can't stand by itself in a sense because...
It's the Empire Strikes Back of its day.
Right, and that was the best movie too, so...
I do. Gods of Mars is, of all the Mars novels, of which there is 11, Gods of Mars is absolutely the best. And it's, I would say, top 5 Burroughs, although don't ask me to list the 5 because it'll shift.
I just reread it about 6 months ago, and it was, just a fantastic
It's
read.
phenomenal.
He didn't know what he was doing, and he just, I mean, now it's very hard to come up with anything unique because our entire culture is a mashup of everything, and there's so much diversity. And
The
so
remix culture.
and so you can come up with something, 2 things that have never gone together,
Chocolate
but
and peanut butter.
it almost doesn't seem, it's almost expected now, or it's almost irrelevant. But when he wrote that book, swashbuckling type of adventures, of course, existed. There's great examples of them, like Count of Monte Cristo, Three Musketeers.
It's also Raphael Sabatini's work.
Yeah, that's, I was just going to, and I'm blanking on the name of Scaramouche.
Oh, okay, yes.
Which is an excellent book. So what I asked was, so he combined these 2 things. How? Well, the question how is almost
irrelevant.
It's an endless question and an irrelevant one, but it's just interesting that so these swashbucklers existed, and then also Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, very early science fiction tales written in the even 1800s, and I mean, even before that, there's things that you could call science fiction. But the first science fiction people going to another planet started around the 19th century. I'm sure that someone's going to...
And a lot of those were astral projection-based stories, which Burroughs used. The idea of people would often... They'd astral project themselves to other planets, and then the planet was usually done for satirical purposes.
So there were early science fiction. There were swashbucklers, and for some reason he got this idea of taking a swashbuckler and having it take place on Mars, which I think there was the fascination of the idea of the canals.
Well, Percival Lowell was a big influence on Burroughs. He's acknowledged that. Percival Lowell was the astronomer who suggested the idea of the canals on Mars. It wasn't a bizarre pseudoscience theory at the time. It was a legitimate scientific theory that was later disproved. Also, there was the popular science articles by a French author named Camille Flammarion, who also had suggested the possibility of a Mars that was living off these canals. There was also a novel that Burroughs may or may not have read by a man named Edwin Lester Arnold called Gulliver Jones, His Vacation, later Gulliver of Mars, which has some similarities to A Princess of Mars, but is not the flat-out... Well, Gulliver Jones is no John Carter. In terms of adventure, John Carter was kind of the secret trick that Burroughs found for that. He made his main character someone who isn't just an adventurer. He is the best ever at everything.
Well, that's and why is he? For one reason, this is the thing that just came in my head, is he's the reverse Superman. Way before Superman, he was the alien that went to another planet and had astounding powers because he was an alien somewhere else, and the gravity affected him differently. So he's the way Superman came from Krypton and is superpowered on the Earth. John Carter went to Mars and was basically a slightly not quite as strong version of Superman. So he was a swordsman that could. I mean, it seems at times that he seems to reduce him almost to this strength of a normal Earthman, depending on the situation for the drama. And other times he's jumping 200 feet into the air.
Yeah, he wipes out in one section of Gods of Mars. He and his son Carthoris take down an army on their own.
Family picnic.
And
that's where the women readers are probably lost on the giant long battle scenes, because I think there's things that would appeal to anyone in those books, but I think the focus on the martial aspect, I think, of a lot of the stories. I think Gods of Mars, it does have the huge battle when they go to rescue Dejah Thoris at the end. But other than that, it's there's so much more happening in that book.
Well, Gods of Mars is loaded with religious satire.
Yeah, in the Gods of Mars, there seems to be a strong criticism of religion or satire. You know, they go to the place that's supposed to be the afterlife. They find out it's this just horrific kind of junkyard for human beings.
Yeah, and the Holy Therns, who see themselves as being the true gods of the planet, at one point one of them screams out quite loudly, "No resurrection, no afterlife, no resurrection." Burroughs was not a religious man, to put it mildly. He never went to church, but he wasn't a full atheist either. He did have some sort of spiritual belief, but it didn't inform his day-to-day life. His attitude in Gods of Mars probably comes from his father, who was staunchly anti-Catholic. And
so that's almost the voice of his father, possibly.
It is. I don't think Burroughs himself was anti-Catholic specifically. He probably heard his father talk about it. But in Gods of Mars, something you'll notice if you look really closely at the religious satire is he's satirizing rituals, and it comes across as I'm thinking, yeah, he's taking his dad's occasional anti-Catholic rant and applying it to the Therns as being a very ritualized society that is built on a fundamental lie. Mm-hmm. John Carter forms together an alliance of Martians of different colors and races to defeat them, which is a incredibly progressive concept.
Yeah, that is. You know, I guess I maybe thought of it when I was reading the book, but now that you bring it up, it's something that's easy to overlook. The time it was written for all these races to combine to defeat this one common foe.
Yeah, Burroughs, like any writer of his time, was certainly going to fall into racial stereotypes. So, but the assumption that Burroughs was just going to be a racist writer falls apart when you read a lot of his early works, where he would come up with these, cross-racial romances. And he would promote the multicolored Martians, like the Therns. The Therns are the villain in Gods of Mars. They're white guys who wear blonde wigs.
Yeah, they're very strange beings.
It is very strange. So Burroughs is just one of those authors that cannot be pinned down very specifically. Yeah, in his later life, he expressed a love of eugenics that is pretty disturbing.
Science will save us.
Burroughs was not a perfect human being, and part of his fallibility as his own personality is one of the reasons he's fascinating. There's always something new to find about him as his own ideas changed, and the way he would often put two different concepts in his writing that seemed to be opposed to each other. Tarzan, just briefly mention him, was a believer in the natural world, and he did not want civilization intruding. In the Earth's Core books, the Pellucidar books, hero David Innes is entirely there to bring civilization to a savage society, including things like typewriters and sewing machines, which he gets really excited about.
That's interesting. That's just the opposite of the Tarzan message. Yeah.
And Tarzan eventually went to Pellucidar. So,
wow, okay.
I don't want to
get rid of the typewriters.
I don't want to get into that now because I have an entire big essay when I get to writing about the fourth installment of the Pellucidar series, which is Tarzan at the Earth's Core, and I'm going to that's a big issue that's going to be dealt with.
I have not read any of the Pellucidar books. I'm going to have to ask you, how are those in your opinion compared to the Mars books?
The Martian books are the most consistently strong, but each series has at least a couple of completely rotten ones. The Pellucidar series starts very strong and sort of maintains its strength through the first 4 books. The next 2 books after that were written during the 30s, which is one of Burroughs' poorest periods, and I would say that Back to the Stone Age and Land of Terror, those 2 books there, are just about Burroughs at his worst. Trying to explain to people, please don't, if you want to read Edgar Rice Burroughs, please don't start with these books, please.
Right. So would you suggest A Princess of Mars?
To start with? There's good and bad reasons to make that the starting point. I'm going to be real boring here and say you should probably read Tarzan of the Apes first.
Okay.
Tarzan of the Apes is, and I'm going to borrow from a video reviewer that I like a lot named Bob Chipman. Tarzan of the Apes is really that good. phenomenally good. And that's his third book, only his third book.
Yeah, that's amazing. I have to pour heaps of shame upon myself because I have actually not read Tarzan yet. So I am going to.
Well, you're actually lucky because you will get to experience it at a kind of an age where you're going to really be even more impressed.
35 years old.
Yes.
Liar, liar, pants on fire.
But I have read all of the Mars books, and I think that it also has to do with interest. I mean, for me, I've always been drawn to the otherworldly aspect, whether it's science fiction or fantasy, of the, I don't know, I have just the idea of another world, the idea of everything being strange and different. I want to go back to something you said, I think is really interesting. You said that you were talking about Burroughs having a paradox in his personality and flaws, but I mean, maybe that's what really makes. I mean, is that, I had to say something really trite? Isn't that what makes human beings interesting? Isn't that what makes human beings human beings? We seem obsessed with nowadays the idea of being perfect. It's like the perfect diet, perfect body, the perfect moral standing, the perfect social standing, the perfect amount of money, the perfect success, and you can't relate to that because there is no model for that. The model for that is not a human being. This is the odd thing: is we aspire to something that, in a sense, there's never been a human being like that. So you wouldn't be a human being if you were those things. So just like you're talking about the gods of Mars, like you start to read it, and one point there's the black man, and they're like, and the way the guy acts, and he's a villain, and it seems kind of racist. And then he ends up becoming one of the heroes, and then it's just there's good black men and there's bad black men, and so that transcending this idea of what annoys me is that nowadays, especially, I don't know how long this has been going on. It's a fairly recent phenomenon of constantly judging writers since we have what they wrote, writers of the past, people of the past generally, but writers of the past, by our current social mores and moral standards, which is completely unfair. Any of us living in that time would have been very different people than the ones we are. So, Robert E. Howard being another example. There's obviously things in there that are offensive, but if you
Lovecraft especially.
Well, yeah, it gets to the point where some people, where it is obviously overtly that people had issues, but people have issues now about all kinds of things. Not all of us get to have all of our personal thoughts and stuff put into writing and be famous 50 or 100 years later to be 100 years later to be criticized. It's just one of my pet peeves, though, and because I find it extremely arrogant and narcissistic. So, I mean, I think that any of us, I mean, I hope that if my writing is read in 50 or 100 years, I'm not judged by those standards, because I guarantee you, folks, people feel so good about themselves now and all their views, and in 50 or 100 years, people are going to look back and go, God, I can't believe they believed that. We can't believe that about ourselves, but it's going to happen.
I think this ties into why I like Burroughs as an academic subject so much. Burroughs is not my actual favorite writer, but he's the writer I enjoy thinking about and writing about the most. You talk about how we might, it seems arrogant to look back and judge them by our current societal standards. For me, all those things in Burroughs are something to engage with. That's one reason that I find Burroughs a fascinating writer, is that no matter what sort of fantastic story he's telling, he always provides the reader with something more to think about, even if it's a negative thing that you don't like. For example, I'll mention from one of his most controversial books, the second of the Venus novels. The Venus series is his poorest series, but this second book, Lost on Venus, has a very lengthy section about eugenics, which is breeding in order to create a superior type of person.
Were these later books then?
This is 1930s, yeah. Which was, you want to breed out undesirable characteristics. So certain people, there's a society on Venus that the hero Carson Napier finds that is entirely based on sterilizing inferior genetic people so they can have their superior genetic race. And these are the good guys in the book. And Carson Napier, it actually even looks at himself and says, I am inferior because I must have had bad breeding in my background. And there's a question, is Burroughs being satirical here, or does he actually mean this? Because his hero is supporting this eugenic society. some people would say Burroughs is doing a parody here, but Burroughs wrote an essay that was never published called I See a New Race, where he was pro-eugenics. But eugenics was an idea that before World War II was actually circulated in academic circles and taken seriously. Then World War II happened, and we discovered what a eugenics program put into action actually
could
look like.
Well, I think that this is a reflection of human beings, the dangerous idea of utopia, desperately trying. This isn't like, oh, evil people would come up with this idea. No, it's like Gandalf, why he didn't want the ring. It's very tempting. How can we end suffering? How can we end war? End all these things? So we'll do it genetically. We'll just breed all these traits out. But none of these. That's the whole thing about once you start trying to do that, you no longer have a human being. And what's odd to me is that when people talk about this kind of thing, it's always to make people with shinier teeth and more wavy hair and 6 foot tall and strong. And but shouldn't we actually just be breeding out anyone who's unhappy? I mean, isn't the point? You never read a book where a eugenics project where we're going to breed out all the people that are assholes and we're going to breed out everyone that's unhappy. Then you just have a happy race. Isn't that what everybody is trying to do? Everybody's trying to be happy, and yet we seem to have this middleman in our way, which is this very materialistic view in Western culture. I mean, there's great things about Western culture. I'm not knocking it. There's great advantages over quote unquote Eastern culture, and both of them have strengths and weaknesses. But in the West, it just this focus on this materialistic view of life, not meaning necessarily money and things, but this idea of appearance and objects, and that happiness is. And as much as we give lip service to this constantly, money doesn't buy happiness, blah blah blah, everyone's still on the same treadmill to have. Then it's just the perfect health, the perfect body, the perfect friends, great skills, all this stuff. But it's like that. We all know that's not where happiness comes from. We're all trying to have some kind of. I mean, it seems if there's anywhere happiness comes from, it comes from accepting the way things are, accepting yourself as you are. Something about I guess I want to go back now to something I said I wanted to touch on, and that's and this is a conversation that we're going to touch on this a little bit, but I'm planning a roundtable discussion with several authors on this. Is fantasy relevant? Is fantasy, I mean, you could say is reading relevant? That's way too long of a discussion, because I feel like we're starting to move out of a literary culture into a visual one. But fantasy literature itself, not taken seriously, I would say. It's looked on as escapist. And looking at 2016...
I want to stop right there when you
sure.
say escapism, because I do have something to say right there, which is, and this comes from Raymond Chandler, in this essay, The Simple Art of Murder, said that all reading for pleasure is escapism, because the human mind must have an escape from its own rhythms. And reading provides that.
From its own rhythms. That's interesting.
And that's actually, I believe that's exactly what he said. So he was trying to argue, when someone tries to talk about escapist literature, any kind of reading for pleasure, he says, is escapist.
That's an interesting idea. And human beings do other things to escape the quote unquote rhythm, which actually is so you don't go crazy. And that there's meditation. I think there's spiritual practices. People engage in games and engage in sports events. We work out. All these things get us out of our mind. I think that's what it is. The funny thing is that even though you use your mind when you read a book, you're getting out of your mind world, which is where most of us spend our lives. And people are not too in touch with this idea of mindfulness, but most of us spend our lives in a fictional mind world that we are convinced is real, with our interpretations of things that have happened in the past, things that are happening now, mostly interpreted through past associations and decisions we made and meanings we made out of the past. And books help us to enter someone else's mind world, a more pleasant world, or a pleasantly presented or a skillfully presented world that helps us to have an escape into not just someone else's mind, but a good writer, I think, is writing something that almost in a Jungian way, it taps into a universal consciousness. That why do we all relate to these great books, which are actually the greatest books are very specific, instead of trying to be general, as Burroughs was trying to do in the book, what was it, The Outlaw of Torn?
Outlaw of Torn.
Yeah. The best books are ones that are deeply personal, deeply specific, and then somehow we relate to that the most.
Yeah. Outlaw of Torn did directly lead to the writing of Tarzan, because there was actually a similar plot mechanic. Both deal with a noble child who is hidden and his parentage disguised from him.
Holy Moses.
And Burroughs just looked at that idea when Outlaw of Torn wasn't selling, told Metcalf, he says, I have this other idea about a kid who grows up in the jungle, and then he just went with it.
So this addresses the idea of the kind of false belief of failure. And in our society, it's like people don't want to fail, but look what happens when you quote unquote fail. You write Outlaw of Torn, and it leads to Tarzan of the Apes.
Yeah. He took a long time to sell Outlaw of Torn, and it actually sold very well when he finally got it published. So even that was a victory.
Yeah, there you go, folks.
Fail
First.
I know some ERB fans, Edgar Rice Burroughs fans, who really like Outlaw of Torn.
So Burroughs may have just reached a point in his life where he wasn't enjoying writing anymore, and
he was also getting old. The simple fact of being tired.
Yeah, maybe he was tired, but some people produce great work when they're older.
And he actually produced, at the very end of his life, he had an upswing, and that's partially the responsibility of World War II, which kind of saved his life in a certain way. He really thought he was about to slide into the grave when he was 65 years old, and this gets into my favorite little Burroughs anecdote, which was Burroughs was an eyewitness to Pearl Harbor.
Ah.
He was living in Honolulu in 1941, and it was a pretty bad point in his writing career. Things weren't selling very well. He was making money off Tarzan strips and the Tarzan movies, although not as much as he deserved to from the movies. And he had just gone through a second divorce, and his son Holbert came out to visit him for a while, and they were relaxing.
Wait, Holbert?
Holbert.
So
Holbert.
He comes up with names like Deja Thoris and all these, and Thuvia, and his son was Holbert.
Holbert. He named him Holbert. Was born before he wrote any of his books.
Ah, okay. Do you think he would have named him something different if he had?
Like Carthoris? I doubt it.
Maybe you named him Carter. Carter Rice Burroughs. That sounds pretty good.
Holbert. The name Holbert comes from his father's side of the family.
Apologies to all Holberts out there.
Slander.
He went by the nickname Holy. Holbert was out to visit him, and they went to play tennis on December 7th, 1941, on the tennis courts at his house, and they started to see smoke and hear bombs coming from over the hillside. They thought it was a military exercise, and they were setting up a smoke barrier, and everyone in the neighborhood just came out to watch from the tennis courts, and they kept playing tennis, too. They didn't really know what was going on, and even when they knew what was going on, they played out the game, which Burroughs said later was just his way of dealing with it.
So, Ryan, how did Edgar Rice Burroughs influence you as an author, or did he influence you as an author?
Well, he definitely influenced me because this is a really, really simple thing, but Edgar Rice Burroughs loved monsters in his stories. And I love monsters in my stories. And he was always just hurling out new, neat monsters for his villains for his heroes to go up against. And I've always just had this passion for putting that kind of humans up against monsters kind of thing. And dinosaurs are a large part of his work, particularly the Land That Time Forgot, which is probably my personal favorite Edgar Rice Burroughs novel. And that book in particular had a strong influence on me because my own Antarctica novels take a lot of this evolutionary stew pot that the land of Caspak is in The Land That Time Forgot.
And Antarctica, spell that.
AHN-TARQ.
Okay, Antarctica.
Yeah.
Where did your fascination with monsters or giant monsters or dinosaurs come from? Specifically, do you know?
Godzilla.
So when did you see the first Godzilla movie?
6.
You were 6 years old?
6 years old, yeah.
Oh, interesting. And you remember?
Oh, yeah, I remember. Oh, yeah, it's one of the worst of the Godzilla films, too, which is amusing to me. They used to show these in the afternoon, and they put up what they called Godzilla on Monster Island, which I now know as Godzilla versus Gigan, which is an absolute heap of garbage.
So that's the movie you saw?
Yeah.
Okay, so you didn't see the original first Godzilla movie?
Oh, no, that would have terrified me too much. That film is too grim.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. See, when I was little, they had a thing back in, long time ago.
1 million BC.
They had a thing called Creature Feature they would show, and I think they may have like brought that name back and used it for something else. But this is I'm not gonna mention the date. They used to show. It was a mixture. They would show like a werewolf movie or something, an old Lon Chaney movie, and then they would show a Japanese monster movie. Just something different every week. But I was very fascinated with that, and books on dinosaurs I used to be very fascinated with. So just briefly talk about your Antarctica series, and if you want to kind of start with talking about the monsters and how the monsters fit into that, but and your story, An Acolyte of Black Spires, that won the Writers of the Future contest, that was an Antarctica story.
Yes, and that's a bizarre case because when I started writing these stories, I planned the idea way back. I remember probably 2005. I first had the early concept of it, which was kind of mix Edgar Rice Burroughs with these Zothique stories of Clark Ashton Smith. That is dinosaurs and a sort of decadent lost society. Eventually I came up with the idea that kind of held it all together, which is that everyone in the society suffers from a sort of a lingering depression. Everybody has chronic depression, which became like the key element of it gave the whole background an actual a general theme. And I started writing the stories about it, and I created these sort of lurking villain characters that I called the Shapers. And I decided one day, well, I should probably know a little bit more about these figures, and I don't want them to be just generic cloaked mysterious bad guys who don't say anything. I'm going to write a story from their point of view, and explored this idea of a member of this race who call themselves the Eldru, living in a tower and just doing research. This is a society of researchers and scientists who are completely beyond basic human understanding. They're cruel and scientific. And I just wrote the story from the point of view of one of them and explored their culture and their society. And I thought, well, no one's ever going to actually read this, and if it does ever get published, there'll be other Antarctica stories already published before. So I had no idea the first story that was going to be published was the one starring the villains. It was very strange to me to think this is the first time people are going to see this world through the viewpoint of its monsters.
Yeah. The fact is that it has to do with one of the Shapers kind of changing and evolving.
Yes.
To me, the most fascinating thing about, I do like what you just said about the combination, because that's kind of what Burroughs did, and nobody had done that before. Nobody had combined going to a planet and swashbuckling. You've combined two things, that kind of Clark Ashton Smith, but that kind of mystical, researchers, like
Jack Vance would be a good example.
Yeah, wizard, dark wizards up in a tower seeking arcane knowledge. Alchemists. What fascinated me is is this idea of the sorrow. No one has ever done this before. You said that this is a world where not everyone suffers from it. It turns out that there are some people that don't, and that's kind of the key theme. One of the key themes of the world is how can people escape from this thing, which we would call depression in modern times. And I was going to joke and say, you're saying this is something that everyone in that world suffers from, and I was going to joke and say completely unlike our world, where I think the last number is 350 million people suffering from depression. And to me, this is an extremely relevant topic, and this idea of the sorrow in your story, when you read what the characters go through, to me it's one of the most convincing and accurate descriptions of what depression actually feels like, because most people don't really understand what depression is, and they think or you're sad, or you've lost hope about something. All these things can be factors of depression, but depression is something that makes you unable to live, and you don't want to live life, and which is the antithesis of what being a human being is like we're human beings, we're living here, we don't understand some deeper purpose, but what we are here to do is to live. And this disease is, or whatever you want to call it, is in a sense like antithetical to that.
The sorrow as it exists in Antarctica is in a lot of ways a reaction to the way I see our society views depression externally. We're a society that is encouraged to constantly be up. Mm-hmm. Be up, be active. Everything that bombards us on television is constantly giving this view that everyone is having more fun than you.
Yeah. Yes. Well, that's essential to sell things.
Yeah. That's how they sell things.
Yes. Very destructive.
Yeah. Even our psychology basically tells us why don't you cheer up?
Put on a happy
And
face.
that is the hardest thing to, and I suffer from depression as well, which I don't think I could have come up with this idea if I didn't. But in Antarctica, it is the way of things, which makes it very different from our culture. Everyone just accepts this is how we all handle things. There's going to be periods of time when you can be okay and work fine, but you're going to need a couple days in which you just lock yourself in a room and you don't come out.
And given any chance to escape it, of course, they just don't think that there is any other way to be.
There's no other way to be.
Because that, say, unlike our world, perhaps, that is the vast majority. There are only actually maybe a handful of people who don't suffer from this, right?
They're the sorrowless who are often the heroes of the stories, and that's not just me doing that to show that they're better. That's because if you're going to have heroes, they need to be a little more active.
It's also a desire. It's also a desire to not want to suffer from depression. I mean, I think on the one end there's didactic art, which is
Non sequitur.
sermonizing, writing something for a moral message, which is about as fun as being stuck in a musty church on a beautiful Sunday morning.
It's the Parson's Tale from Canterbury Tales, the one you don't read.
There you go. And then the other end is pornographic art.
The Miller's Tale.
Miller's Tale. Pornographic tale is written surely for maybe that sheer escapism or pleasure. Or as Campbell talked about, and you look at a painting and it's not that you're wowed by the painting, but you see the forest in the painting. You're saying, oh, that's so beautiful. I would like to be at that forest. True art is neither one of those. True art is where you look at the painting and you are awed into a moment of silence. I think if you read a good book and your mind becomes silent, it's the same thing. He calls it transparent to transcendence. So it's like opening this window onto the transcendent, which is the transcendent being the ineffable, something that there is no words for it. Religious people would use it, the word God. People maybe that believe in some deep human psychological concept, like what Colin Wilson believed in faculty X,
Faculty
or
X,
the super subconscious or something. Whatever way, it's something that there's no explanation. And I always think of Frank Frazetta's work. I mean, obviously you could think of Michelangelo or someone, but I think of Frank Frazetta because Frank Frazetta's work is can be such geeky fantasy work for the subject matter. But when you look at a great Frazetta painting, you don't go, oh, look at the cool barbarian with a sword. You see that second. You're awed by the painting itself. His best work is equal to the classical masters. So sorry, I went off on a complete tangent there on Frank Frazetta. Well, I think the point I was getting to was that your story, An Acolyte of Black Spires, is not a didactic piece. I don't think that when you were writing it, you probably intended this, but to me, I see the shaper who ends up escaping from his people, from his culture, leaving, becoming outcast, as someone emerging from depression somehow, finding a way.
An Acolyte of Black Spires, and I know some people who have read it have thought that I was trying to do a little bit of the version of the fun girl who pulls the morose guy out of his shell.
I was gonna bring that up, and I definitely would disagree with that description. But I was gonna ask.
It's certainly not what I didn't think that when I was writing it. I can guarantee you that.
Right. Well, all the best things we write, we're not thinking about them consciously. That was my point about going for walks or waking up from naps and some Edison and who was the other person they did this kind of it's like they would. Right when they woke up from a nap, they would write down the first idea that came to their mind. Well, these ideas are deeply subconscious, or they're deeply part of us. And if we try to write them about them consciously, they come off as stupid and cheesy and sermonizing. But how does he get out of the tower? He ends up kind of falling for this woman.
He falls for her and then discovers that he finds out she's in the tower specifically to steal something. She's been disguised as a shaper, as an eldru, which is very difficult to do. Because it's a very alien culture to the humans. And she then reveals that what she is stealing is him.
Right.
They specifically want... I know we're sort of spoiling the story, but I don't really care, honestly. Yeah.
Spoiler alert!
I think it's going to get people to want to read it more than anything. People worry about spoiler alerts.
I don't really believe in... I really kind of am tired of the anti-spoiler culture and our obsession with it to some extent. You have to talk about this if you want to talk about the story.
Right. So she's in there to actually steal him, because information you want.
They need information,
which is kind of sad because he kind of falls for her.
He falls for her, and she's not going to be with him. Yeah. I had to have that conclusion where he sees that she is with someone else. And I had to have that because any kind of really upbeat ending would seem completely false to me.
Yes, I agree.
It's totally did not make
Well,
sense.
the upbeat ending is that he's out of that culture and he has a chance to live a different life.
Yeah, but it's going to be a hard existence. When we see him again, and this is in Turn Over the Moon, he shows up near the end of the story, and he's still with this same group of Sorrowless and the woman whose name is Hollett, who stole him out of there, and he's still in love with her. He's pretty clearly so, but she's not going to be, sleeping with an ugly-looking, weird-looking alien creature, and
Who's depressed all
the time. And
poor guy.
Yeah, poor guy, and that helps him.
And that's when he started his comic book collection.
Yeah, that's
Slander.
Apologies to all comic book collectors.
the other strain of Antarctica stories. The Belda, who was kind of like the main hero of Antarctica.
Turn Over the Moon.
Turn Over the Moon. She's the hero in Turn Over the Moon.
A fine novel.
And by complete mistake, when I first wrote Belda's short story, which is you can get on Amazon, it's called Farewell to Tyrn, Tyrn. I wrote her short story about her little adventure in a city in the summer when Shapers come to seize her father, thinking he's sorrowless, only to turn out it's her. And it's her realization that she is sorrowless. It's an awakening for any child the moment they realize there's something different about them. When you're growing up, you might not know that you're any different than other people in particular. You just think everyone thinks the same way that you do. And at one point you might realize, oh wait, I'm not like other people. Something is different.
She's a super freak.
She doesn't understand the sorrow. Everyone has it. She assumes she has it, but doesn't. And she's confused why her friends one day just want to all go home and don't want to play anymore. And she even at one point asks her pet dinosaur, says, what's wrong with not being afraid? What's wrong with not being afraid of the world because it's just the world? And that for me kind of became a key moment in understanding what the sorrow was, which is it's fear of the world because the world exists.
It's alive.
And the sorrowless
Yeah, the ultimate existential crisis.
They feel they are out of place and nothing can fix this. The sorrowless are not happy all the time. That's a key thing that Belda in her story encounters, which is that she goes through a lot of pain and a lot of sadness, but she can always pinpoint why she is sad and unhappy.
Right, and she's capable often of a wide variety of emotions.
Yeah. Something that someone with a sorrow would not be able to conceive of. Going after someone for revenge? No.
Takes too much energy.
That's too much energy, and the idea of itself is depressing.
Yeah, right. So everything is self-defeating before you begin. Well, that's definitely a key element of depression, and that's I feel that these stories, this world is so relevant. So many people, even if they don't suffer clinically from depression, people experience these kind of emotions, and this idea of all human beings. I feel you talked about the girl, what's her name? Belda, not feeling like she fits in. Well, everyone. This is the odd thing about being a human being is everyone feels this way. People feel this way so much that they do horrific things to fit in. We feel isolated as human beings, and we do feel like we feel different. We're different than everyone else, and that's the teenage adolescent years are the peak of the beginning of that of feeling like you don't fit in. So everyone's becomes a fan of a band and dresses alike. The ironic thing is that we all feel that way, but when we admit, instead of trying to fit in or trying to forcing yourself to be happy or whatever, when you admit the way things are, you accept the way you are, then you look around and realize that everyone else almost feels exactly the same as you do. And this is the irony, is that we all are, as human beings, are unique in a way, and yet that's kind of what binds us together, is that we all are trying to understand something that can't be understood. We're trying to live life, which isn't a thing that you can figure out in your head. Whenever I talk to a Lyft driver and find out that how they were actually doing, we have this substantive conversation. I could tell they felt much better, and I got out of the Lyft, out of the car, and I felt much. That's not something that you can explain either. You have a connection with other human beings, and suddenly things are okay, even if they're not okay. And that's, again, it's kind of a mystery. But I hope that the stories do well. And I know that Turn Over the Moon you've had with a very reputable New York agent for some time, but it has not sold.
Not sold, no.
Yeah, and I just wish you luck with that. And maybe if Dream Tower Media gets funding for some projects that we have planned. That's one of them that's definitely come to mind is to be able to do to publish your book and to do it the way that a major publisher would not ever do it, which would be actually to spend money on 6 to 12 inside paintings in the inside and do a lavish, old-fashioned, antique-looking hardback.
As long as you get someone who can illustrate Bilda the way I want her to look.
Well, I know somebody that can do that.
Yeah.
His name is Zoltan.
Shameless plug. ZoltanIllustration.com.
Sorry, getting back to the idea of a book. Last thing I guess I would say is the Edgar Rice Burroughs articles for Black 8. Mm-hmm. Any idea of compiling those together into a book?
Yes, I've actually been already experimenting with how the table of contents for that would work.
So look for those books coming out. Look for his story, An Acolyte of Black Spires, which is in the Writers of the Future number 28 anthology, and his other story,
Farewell to Tyrn.
Farewell to Tyrn, and that's available on Amazon. If you just look up Ryan Harvey, find his Amazon page, and you'll find his other work that's available. Well, Ryan, thanks so much for joining me and Edgar today in the Dream Tower.
It's been a fantastic time. Thank you.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun.
It's been a
So let me just show you the way out. Oh, hold on. I've got something that might help with those Pteranodons on your way back down the hill.
Okay.
Now I've got something in here. Hey, Ryan. Your father wanted you to have this when you were old enough.
No, not enough reach.
Oh, yeah. You're right. Let's see. Crossbow?
A bit too cumbersome.
Yeah. Here we go, my friend.
Hey, an old-fashioned blaster.
Yeah, a very old model, but it still works. Well, it did the last time I used it. And let me check. Yep, it's still got a charge. Here you go.
Thanks.
Hey, thank you for coming.
Arrivederci, baby.
Now take care of yourself. Happy riding.
All right, so long.
Ooh, nice one, Ryan. How do you like that, Edgar? A nice guy, a good rider, and a pretty darn fine shot.
Murder.
Join us next month for the March Literary Wonder and Adventure podcast, Orcs, a conversation with historical fantasy author Scott Oden. Literary Wonder and Adventure podcast, produced by Robert Zoltan for Dream Tower Media. Go to dreamtowermedia.com to sign up for the newsletter to be informed of upcoming podcasts and other exciting news. Literary Wonder and Adventure podcast theme song, Rogues of Mirth main theme, is available at dreamtowermedia.com. Original content, copyright 2017 Dream Tower Media. Music by Robert Salish. Copyright 2017 Kiss the Girl Music. Until next time.
So long, folks.